and governor. But in a positive sign for the president, and everything is relative, a new CNN poll has his job approval now at 44%. That's up from 38% over the summer. Let's discuss. Hanim Malika Henderson, nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
Let me start with you.
Yeah.
So the Senate candidates in Arizona and Nevada kind of avoiding President Biden. Tim Ryan in Ohio on a debate stage did everything he could to distance himself from Joe Biden. How much of a negative do Democrats see the president right now?
Listen, 44%, that's at a high. In some ways, he's been able to, I think, have Democrats rally around him a bit more. But it's still not enough if you are campaigning in these states that are essentially red states, right, or purple states. If you're thinking about Nevada, Ohio, a red state, and it's a red year. So you have all of these candidates trying to really talk about their bipartisan bona fides. I mean, you've got, for instance, Warnock in Georgia talking more about the work he's done with Ted Cruz than any work he's done with Biden, because those are the voters, the sort of swing voters that they need to really get. So listen, I think it's a sign of a healthy campaign that they're able to be this nimble and kind of keep Joe Biden at a distance, but also sort of try to rally Democrats, but also think about those independent voters.
You know, Stuart Stevens, if you look at where Joe Biden's approval rating is, it's right around where Barack Obama's and Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan's were at this stage of their first term. And there's one thing all three of those guys have in common, which is that they won re-election. However, there's a second thing they all have in common, which is they all lost a lot of seats. They lost a lot of seats in their first midterms. So is that inevitable to an extent?
Well, it's only 3 times in the last 125 years, I think, that the party in power gained seats. The last time was 2002, and I worked on that race. We were able to nationalize it around domestic security. I think what's going on here is that the world is very different than it used to be. So you have Donald Trump, and you have a large group of the Republican Party that doesn't believe that Joe Biden is a legal president. So for Democrats to win, I think it needs to be a referendum on democracy and a referendum on Trumpism. And having Joe Biden there doesn't necessarily deliver that message. You don't want this to be a referendum on Joe Biden. I mean, ultimately, if this is a race about inflation, a race about gas prices, that's a hard race to win. I think there's a race that they can win, which is about democracy and about the threat that they pose to the country, because we really are in unique times. So I think that the greater the stakes, the better Democrats will do. It'll increase turnout. So I think you got to make a state-by-state decision whether or not to do it. I think the Biden organization is playing this right. They're not putting pressure on anybody. But I think it's very difficult to compare this race to what our traditional politics has been before.
Things have changed. Do you think, Beth?
I do. Listen, I think everybody's absolutely right. You do it on a state-by-state basis. I think Bernie Sanders is right in his op-ed the other day that even though abortion is very important and should be front and center, we should be able to talk about other issues like gas prices. Don't cede ground to that. You saw Tim Ryan do that in his debate the other day with Vance, not ceding ground on a number of issues, including law enforcement, and the fact that threats to democracy are polling so high, you have to be able to talk about that. I don't think Joe Biden is good at that in every place all the time. Certainly not in a lot of the states that you mentioned here. But one of the things that I want to be clear about is that it shouldn't be about Joe Biden not doing the job we elected him to do. He actually is. He's brought us back to a place of normalcy, at least coming directly from the White House. And even though Democrats may not have gotten everything they wanted, I think a lot feel that they've gotten more than they thought they would from a policy perspective in this first term. So I do think there's enough for Democrats to talk about. But based on those nuances and some of those policy issues, it may not work in every place.
Let's talk about a couple specific Senate races here. In Senate, obviously much more case by case than the House, which sometimes follows national trends. I want to start in Georgia, where Herschel Walker did a sit-down interview with Lindsey Davis on ABC News, and he came out with sort of a new line of defense about these allegations that he paid, or was asked, we paid for an abortion. Listen.
Are you saying a flat-out denial to any knowledge of an abortion, or is it possible it happened and you don't remember?
Flat-out denial, lie. And what's sad about it, he had, a receipt and had a check and had all that. He hadn't shown anything. He hadn't shown me saying something about an abortion, and that's what's terrible.
He's just saying it never happened. And I do want to point out there's a new poll out of Georgia today, which we should look at right now, which has Raphael Warnock, the Quinnipiac poll, up 7 there. But this line that, no, nothing to see here, didn't happen at all, how tenable is that for Walker?
Well, listen, I think the worry that Republicans have about Walker is precisely interviews like this, where it's a flat out denial. He's essentially calling the mother of his 10-year-old child a liar in that interview. Are more shoes to drop? Does she want to come out and add to this story? I think that's the problem, that Walker himself isn't the best messenger. He, for instance, has been trying to say, well, he's a born-again Christian. I guess he's born again and again and again, because a lot of the claims that she is making happened after he was a born-again Christian. So I think that's the problem. Listen, I think this is going to hurt his race. You can see that sometimes in the polling. I think the question is, how much does it hurt his race? We've seen things like this happened before. I think what we haven't seen is a son come out and denounce a father in that way. And, sort of, there isn't really people really rallying behind Herschel Walker who know him. Members of his church, for instance, a pastor, anyone, right? A wife. And I think that is hurting his explanation as well.
If I can, I want to turn to the Pennsylvania Senate race and John Fetterman, who also gave an interview. And during this interview, he explained how, in order to sit down, he asked for closed captioning so he could read the questions because he has auditory processing issues from the stroke that he had. Listen to this.
I use captioning, so that's really the major challenge. And every now and then I'll miss a word, every now and then, or sometimes I'll maybe mush two words together. But as soon as I have captioning, I'm able to understand exactly what's being asked.
Stuart Basil, how much of an issue do you think this will end up being in Pennsylvania?
Well, that's a good question. To me, this is a continuation of this trend in Republican politics. Donald Trump ran for president mocking a disabled reporter. Yeah, it's an extraordinary cruelty that's being shown by the Republican Party. So here's someone who had a stroke. A lot of people have strokes. He's on a path to recovery. No one is disputing that. So what if he was blind? If he was deaf? What if he was born without two arms? Or they say he can't sign legislation? It's an attempt to disqualify someone because they don't really have any issues that they're running on. So Oz is really saying, this person, it's just an attack on a disease. It's an attack on someone that terrible happened to a person who's on a path of recovery. My question is, I know that Fetterman's going to recover from this stroke. What is Dr. Oz going to recover from?
It's not
What's going to make him like a real person?
It's not disqualifying. It's not prohibitive, and it borders on discrimination against the disabled. And so you're absolutely right. He can do everything we need him to do when he gets to the Senate.
All right, friends, thank you so much for joining us. Nice seeing you all.